Hello, this is Alan. Hey, I just want to take a few minutes and share with you something I ran across the other day. And this isn't going to be like a word perfect video. I'm just going to talk to you a little bit. I went back, I was searching for something on my website, and I usually don't go back and read my own posts. I probably should. There'd probably be a lot less typos that way, but I don't. And I was searching for something on my website, and I came across this post that I wrote on March 13th, 2018, called The Future of Church. And it struck me because things that I had written back in March of 2018 is exactly what we're living right now. Now, I'm not saying this, in the guise of, oh, look how smart I am, because, to be honest with you, I'm just as surprised as you are that I got something this right. And I start out this post and I talk about how I was reluctant to share these things, but they'd kind of, been on my heart, and things that I'd been sensing for a while. It starts off and it talks about problems with church buildings. And it's not the exact problems that we're having right now due to the coronavirus pandemic, but we do have a problem with church buildings. I mean, there are no mega churches meeting right now. Well, I guess there was one a couple of days ago. Or, 30% of churches are meeting in in-person services. Most of those churches have about 25% in attendance, and maybe that's all they're allowed because of the spacing issues. I know of one church that they're at about 40% of their summer attendance, but they're in North Dakota, in a county that has literally 3 cases of coronavirus, and they're at 40%. So for the most part, buildings are not being used, and it's not the problems that I initially talked about in this, but as we get into this, it's going to make a little more sense. One of the questions I asked is a question that Rick Russo and Eric Swanson asked in their book, The Externally Focused Church. They said, if your church disappeared from your community, would you be missed? Right now, your church, your services, your in-person services, the things that happened in your building, your church has disappeared from your community. Is it being missed? That's a hard question. Because I know that pastors work hard. I know that they invest a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into the work of the ministry. But is what we're doing being missed? Here's the other thing we go to, and that is that, the attractional model was a great model for the last 30, 40 years. And we saw a lot of people come to Christ. We saw a lot of great churches built. We saw a lot of great things happen because of that. And yet the reality is that what happened in the last 30, 40 years, what we were successful with, is not the next 30, 40 years. And that's what I talk about in the article. Well, here's the reality. As of 4 months ago, nothing that we've ever done is working as well as what we did before, because the whole game has changed. The whole scenario has changed. And I hear of a lot of pastors really struggling with discouragement right now, because if you're holding yourself to a standard that you had a year ago, if you're still defining a win by what you had a year ago, that's a very discouraging, very depressed place, because we don't even live in that world anymore. And yet, there are other ways that we can begin to measure how effective we are. So I get into a few points, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but the first thing I talk about is decentralized organization. And we could not be more decentralized than we are right now. Borrowing from Dave Ferguson and Warren Burton, Hero Maker, the hero in any church is the member, not the pastor. And so when you think of your congregation, you have to ask yourself, do you see your congregation as an audience or as an army? Because if they're an audience, they have to be entertained. You have to perform for them. You have to give them something so that they're going to keep coming back. And the win is that they come back. But if we see our congregations as an army, then we see a group of people that need to be equipped and empowered to serve. So what they need from us is they need permission and opportunity. So your church building may not be functioning in the way that it does, but your church is in the community. Your church is dispersed. Some people have more time on their hands right now. Some people don't. But how could you encourage your church to serve others, to check in on their neighbors, to check in on elderly people, to make calls, to send texts? I mean, we're on our phones all the time. Why not do that to encourage other people and see how they're doing? You see, the focus changes from gathering to scattering. This is what I say in the article. The focus changes from gathering to scattering. The last 25 or more years, we have gathered well, but scattered poorly. It's time for a change. Well, guess what? It changed. But if we're in a gathering mindset in a scattering climate, we're living in a very frustrated place. So we have to embrace the scattered mindset. Here's something interesting. You know, the fulfillment of Acts 1:8. Acts 1:8, Jesus said to his disciples, "But you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, and to the uttermost parts of the earth." The fulfillment of Acts 1:8 is found in Acts 8:1. Persecution hit the church in Jerusalem, and they were scattered to Judea and Samaria. We're not in persecution per se. Some people would say that we are, but we've definitely been scattered. And so how can we use this scattering as an opportunity to fulfill our mission? All right, second thing, flexible, unstructured gatherings. Now, this goes back to a conversation I had about 8 years ago with Josh Surratt at Seacoast Church. And we were just talking, and he said that there were members of his church that had moved to the state of Maine, and that they had about 30 people that were gathering at their house to watch Seacoast service every week. And I looked at Josh and I said, well, maybe you need to redefine what a campus is. And this was I know there were different people at different times, kind of in the same time period, 8-10 years ago, that began to think about this notion of microsite churches. And so these are smaller communities or places where multi-site churches maybe wouldn't be built. And so the question I ask in the article is, what if the service via streaming video was brought into homes, restaurants, or smaller meeting places to serve these areas? If your church is not meeting in person, which they're not, 30% maybe, right? You have microsite churches. You have families gathered in homes, or maybe a few people are doing watch parties where they've invited some neighbors. But right now you have microsite gatherings. The challenge right now, and I attend a multi-site campus that has a video venue. So there's a campus pastor and a team, and there's live worship and a service host, and then the message is on video. Why would I go back to my video streamed multi-site campus when I can stay home and watch it in my microsite campus? And if I want more people to gather with me, I can invite them to my house. Right now, there is not a multi-site campus in this country that is meeting, period. And if you don't agree with me, or if you have a campus that's meeting, then argue with me in the comments. Let me know. Multi-site is gone. Multi-site might be dead. Recently, there was an article about Church of the Highlands losing 2 of their campus locations that were in public school auditoriums. And the school board had disallowed Highlands from using these campuses because Pastor Chris Hodges had liked a tweet. These were two buildings. One of them had gone for a couple of years. One of them had gone for several years. These were two buildings that Highlands had paid like $800,000 in rent. But here's the other side of it. Nobody was meeting in those buildings anyway because of the pandemic. They had all been closed down. There was no reason to pay rent on a building. There was no reason to maintain a building for a multi-site campus that nobody was meeting in because everybody was meeting at home. So let's fast forward. And so in the article I talk about, by developing a microsite strategy with online video and support, there's no limit to a church's potential to reach any community that can provide someone to pioneer the work. So you look at J.D. Greer at the Summit Church in Raleigh, North Carolina. And they are not meeting in in-person services for the rest of this year. But what they're doing is, instead of having 12,000 people meet in 12 locations, they're going to have 15,000 people meet, 3,000 more, 15,000 people meet in 2,400 locations. And those locations being the homes of their members. So going back to the article, these flexible, unrestricted gatherings can multiply without church-owned property or paid staff. Now, there needs to be some training. So where do you get trained volunteers? Well, this goes to the next point in this article, and that is meaningful volunteer ministry. I hate the word volunteer because Paul says to the Corinthians that one part of the body can't say to another part of the body, I don't need you. And so we've gotten to the point of we keep hiring all of these people to do tasks because maybe that's easier to motivate them and get them to meet a deadline than a volunteer would be. But the reality is that every one of us have spiritual gifts that God's given us. Every one of us have a calling. The calling is not just limited to clergy, that ministry is not limited to paid staff. And so we get this mentality of volunteers. Well, what do we need volunteers for? Most of the volunteers that church need to maintain their worship services are not needed right now. So again, quoting from this piece, the church burdens many of its members with meaningless ministry. Parking lot attendants, greeters, coffee servers, and so forth. Potentially the worst staff position in any church is the guest services coordinator, because this person must constantly hustle to fill vacant spots every week of the year. Why? Because no one is called to this. I tell you what, right now, if you're a guest services coordinator and your church is only meeting online, you're like the happiest person in the world. You're like on vacation. But here's the thing. Believers will rise to the occasion for gift-based ministry, things that they're called to, things that they see a need and they could fill it and they could do something about it and use their gifts and abilities, and they just need to be equipped. They need to be released to do that. That J.D. Greer said this, that even when you can't come to church, you can still be the church. And you look at Ephesians 4, that the work of pastors and teachers is to equip the saints for doing the work of the ministry. So we are decentralized. People can use their gifts. They can invite people into their homes. And the church can be the church. And even though we can't meet in person, and even though it doesn't revolve around the building, this is a shift. This is a major shift. Multiplication. Microsites are easier to multiply than megachurches. And you think, well, what about training? What are they doing in the houses? Well, they're being friendly. They're getting some people together. They're watching the service online. And here's the thing. You can train somebody to do a microsite more quickly than you can train a pastor. A person doing a microsite doesn't have to have a master of divinity, but they have to have supervision and they have to have somebody willing to help them. Most churches will never have the budget, paid staff, or buildings to accomplish what God has called them to. Most churches will never have that. You know that. And yet, the church already has millions and millions of dollars worth of property in the homes of the church members. And the staff originates from gifts-based assessments. Now, when I wrote this on March 13th, 2018, this might have all seemed weird to you. Some of it may still seem weird to you right now. But these are some things that if we put into practice right now, it would make a huge impact in our communities and in our world. We have a world that is hurting in so many ways. They're afraid of a virus. They're afraid of meeting together. They can't see a loved one in a hospital. Some of them can't even go to a funeral. We have political unrest to an extent that I don't even remember in my lifetime. We have racial injustice. We have so many things that are plaguing our country, and there's such a great spiritual need. In fact, I would say the last time we saw a spiritual need at this level was 9/11. And if you remember, after September 11th, 2001, that next Sunday, our churches were packed. And yet people are feeling that anxiety, the depression, as this continues to go on, the uncertainty of all of this, not knowing if they're going to have a job, not knowing if they're going to be able to buy food. I mean, there's so much uncertainty in all of this, but they can't go to church, or they're afraid to go to church. But they can go online, they could go to a friend's house, they could go to a small group, they could watch a streaming service. See, here's the crazy thing. These things that I'm talking about, a year ago, they were a novelty, right? 4 months ago, this became a necessity. Today, this is an opportunity.